What if someone could see death before it arrived? What would you do if every word they spoke came true? Tonight, we dive into one of the most chilling and mysterious stories ever recorded from the American South. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will leave you speechless. The Georgia sun had barely kissed the horizon when Samuel first spoke of death. It was March 1847, and the Whitmore Plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of red clay and cotton fields, home to over 200 enslaved souls who worked from dawn until their bodies could give no more. Samuel was different from the others. At 35, his weathered hands told stories of countless harvests, but his eyes held something deeper, a distant look that made even the overseers uncomfortable. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, moving through his days with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned that survival meant invisibility. Born on the plantation to parents who had died when he was barely 10, Samuel had grown up under the watchful eye of Mama Rose, the elderly woman who served as both midwife and spiritual guide to the enslaved community. She had always said there was something special about Samuel, something that set him apart from the other children. While they played and laughed despite their circumstances, Samuel would often sit alone, staring into the distance as if he could see things that existed beyond the physical world. The other workers had grown accustomed to Samuel's quiet nature over the years. He was reliable, never caused trouble, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense when the overseers were approaching, allowing his fellow workers to adjust their pace or hide contraband before being caught. Some attributed this to his keen hearing, others to an intuition born of years of careful observation. None suspected that Samuel's awareness extended far beyond the immediate dangers of plantation life. That morning, as the field hands gathered for their daily assignments, Samuel stopped dead in his tracks, his dark eyes fixed on something no one else could see, and his voice cut through the humid air like a blade. "Old Martha won't see another sunset," he said, his words barely above a whisper. "The fever's already in her bones. By evening she'll be calling for her mama, and by midnight she'll be gone." The other workers exchanged nervous glances. Martha was the plantation's eldest enslaved woman, nearly 70, who had been complaining of aches for days. But she was still working, still moving, still very much alive. Martha had survived more hardships than most could imagine, the death of 3 children sold away from her, countless beatings, and the grinding poverty that defined their existence. If anyone seemed indestructible, it was Martha. "Boy, you best keep your mouth shut about such things," warned Big Tom, a massive man whose scarred back spoke of too many encounters with the overseer's whip. "Master Whitmore don't take kindly to talk of death among his property." Big Tom had reason to be cautious. He had seen what happened to enslaved people who were perceived as troublemakers, or who spoke of things that made the white folks uncomfortable. The auction block was always hungry for fresh bodies, and masters had no qualms about selling away anyone who disrupted the careful balance of fear and control that kept the plantation running smoothly. But Samuel's prediction haunted everyone throughout that long day. As they picked cotton under the merciless sun, workers found themselves stealing glances at Martha, watching for signs of the doom Samuel had foretold. The old woman seemed to sense their attention, occasionally looking up from her work with a puzzled expression, wondering why everyone was watching her so intently. The heat that day was particularly oppressive, with humidity so thick it felt like breathing through wet cloth. The cotton plants stood motionless in the still air, their white bowls gleaming like tiny skulls in the harsh sunlight. Even the insects seemed sluggish, and the usual chatter among the workers was replaced by an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the rhythmic sound of cotton being pulled from its stems. By afternoon, Martha began to stumble. Her usual steady pace faltered, and she pressed her hand to her forehead, complaining of a sudden chill despite the oppressive heat. The other workers noticed immediately, the same people who had been watching her all day with Samuel's words echoing in their minds. "Martha, you feeling poorly?" asked Ruth, a middle-aged woman who worked nearby. "Just a little dizzy," Martha replied, but her voice lacked its usual strength. "Probably just the heat getting to me." The overseer, James Crawford, a cruel man with pale eyes and a permanent sneer, noticed her struggling. Crawford was known throughout the plantation for his particular brand of cruelty. He seemed to take pleasure in finding reasons to use his whip, and his pale eyes were always searching for signs of weakness or defiance among the workers. "Get back to work, old woman," he barked, cracking his whip in the air. "I don't pay you to rest." The irony of his words wasn't lost on anyone present. Enslaved people weren't paid at all, their labor stolen day after day, year after year. But no one dared point out this obvious contradiction. Crawford's whip spoke louder than logic, and everyone had learned to keep their observations to themselves. But Martha's condition worsened rapidly. As the sun began its descent, she collapsed between the cotton rows, her body burning with fever. The transformation was so sudden and dramatic that even Crawford seemed taken aback. One moment she was upright, the next she was on the ground, her body convulsing with chills despite the sweat pouring from her skin. The other workers carried her to her cabin, a small cramped structure she shared with 2 other elderly women. The cabin was stifling hot, with barely enough room for 3 straw mattresses and a few personal belongings. But it was the only privacy any of them had, the only space that belonged to them in any meaningful way. As Martha lay delirious, calling out for her mother who had died decades ago, exactly as Samuel had predicted, word spread quickly through the quarters. People gathered outside her cabin, some praying, others simply standing in stunned silence as they witnessed the fulfillment of Samuel's first prophecy. "Mama, I'm coming," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can see you waiting for me." At the stroke of midnight, Martha drew her last breath, her final exhale so soft it was almost imperceptible. The women who had been keeping vigil with her closed her eyes and began the quiet preparations for burial that had become all too familiar in their community. The news spread through the slave quarters like wildfire. Samuel had seen it all, every detail, every moment, as if he had been there when death came calling. Some whispered that he had been blessed with the sight, others feared he had been cursed. Master Whitmore, a portly man in his 50s with thinning hair and a perpetual frown, dismissed the incident as coincidence when Crawford reported it the next morning. Whitmore was a practical man who prided himself on his rational approach to plantation management. He kept detailed records of his human property, tracking their health, productivity, and value with the same attention he gave to his livestock and equipment. "Superstitious nonsense," Whitmore muttered, adjusting his spectacles as he reviewed the plantation ledger. The old woman was clearly ill. Anyone could have seen she was failing. These people are always looking for signs and portents in the most ordinary events. But Samuel knew better. He had seen Martha's death in a dream so vivid it felt more real than waking life. He had watched her final moments unfold behind his closed eyelids, felt the weight of her passing before it happened. The vision had come to him unbidden, as clear and undeniable as the sunrise. And deep in his heart, he knew this was only the beginning. The gift, or curse, that had awakened within him felt like a heavy burden settling on his shoulders. He had always been sensitive to the moods and emotions of those around him, but this was different. This was knowledge that no human being should possess, the ability to see across the veil that separated life from death. 3 weeks passed before Samuel spoke again. The plantation had settled into its usual rhythm of back-breaking labor and quiet desperation when he made his second prediction. The memory of Martha's death had begun to fade for some, dismissed as coincidence or the natural result of an elderly woman's declining health. But for others, particularly those who had witnessed Samuel's strange behavior that day, the incident remained fresh and troubling. During those 3 weeks, Samuel found himself the subject of intense scrutiny from his fellow workers. Some watched him with hopeful eyes, wondering if his gift might somehow be used to their advantage, perhaps to predict when overseers would be absent, or when opportunities for escape might arise. Others regarded him with suspicion and fear, crossing themselves when he passed and whispering prayers for protection against whatever dark forces they believed surrounded him. Samuel himself was struggling with the implications of what had happened. The vision of Martha's death had been so clear, so undeniable, that he couldn't dismiss it as imagination or coincidence. But accepting the reality of his gift meant accepting a responsibility he wasn't sure he was prepared to bear. What was the purpose of seeing death if he couldn't prevent it? Was he meant to warn people, or would his warnings only cause unnecessary suffering? It was during the evening meal, As the enslaved workers gathered in the communal area behind the quarters, the air was thick with the smell of cornbread and whatever vegetables they had managed to grow in their small garden plots. These evening gatherings were one of the few times when the community could come together, sharing not just food but stories, songs, and the small comforts that made their harsh existence bearable. The garden plots were a source of particular pride for the enslaved community. Despite working from dawn to dusk in the master's fields, many found the energy to tend small patches of vegetables behind their quarters. These gardens provided not just supplemental nutrition, but a sense of ownership and accomplishment that was otherwise denied to them. Tomatoes, okra, collard greens, and sweet potatoes grew in neat rows, tended with the same care and expertise that made the plantation's cotton crop so profitable. Conversations were hushed, always hushed, because even in their brief moments of rest, the overseer's ears were never far away. Crawford had a habit of making unexpected rounds through the quarters, claiming he was checking for contraband or signs of rebellion, but everyone knew he simply enjoyed the power of disrupting their few moments of peace. Samuel sat apart from the others, as was his custom, when suddenly he stood and walked to the center of the group. His movements were deliberate, almost trance-like, and his voice carried an authority that made everyone stop eating. The transformation was startling. The quiet, reserved man they knew seemed to grow taller, his presence filling the space in a way that commanded attention. "Young Peter," he said, his gaze finding the 18-year-old who worked in the stables. "3 days from now, the black stallion will throw you. Your head will strike the fence post and you won't wake up." Peter, a spirited young man with dreams of escape burning in his chest, laughed nervously. He was one of the few enslaved workers who had been born on the plantation and had never known any other life. Yet he possessed an optimism and energy that seemed to defy their circumstances. His work with the horses had given him a sense of purpose and skill that set him apart from the field hands, and he took pride in his ability to handle even the most difficult animals. "You're talking crazy, old man. I've been handling horses since I was knee-high. That stallion knows me better than his own shadow. We understand each other, that horse and me." Peter's confidence wasn't misplaced. He had a natural gift with animals that even Master Whitmore acknowledged. The horses responded to his touch and voice in ways that amazed even the white stable hands who worked alongside him. The black stallion, in particular, had been considered unrideable until Peter began working with him, gradually earning the animal's trust through patience and gentle persistence. But the older workers remembered Martha. They remembered how precisely Samuel's words had come to pass, and fear began to creep into their hearts like morning fog. The coincidence of Samuel's prediction and Martha's death was too exact, too detailed to dismiss easily. "Maybe you should stay away from the stables for a while," suggested Ruth, a middle-aged woman who worked in the main house and had developed a maternal fondness for Peter. "Just until—" "Until what?" Peter interrupted, his voice rising with frustration. "Until I let some fever dream control my life. I got work to do, and Master Whitmore expects his horses tended. You think he's going to accept Samuel had a vision as an excuse for neglecting my duties?" Ruth worked as a house servant, which gave her insights into the master's moods and expectations that the field hands lacked. She had seen how quickly Whitmore's favor could turn to wrath, how a single perceived slight could result in a beating or worse. The house servants lived in a precarious position, closer to the family's daily life but also more visible when things went wrong. Samuel said nothing more. He simply returned to his seat and continued eating as if nothing had happened, but his eyes held a sadness that spoke of knowledge no man should possess. The weight of what he had seen pressed down on him like a physical burden, and he found himself wondering if ignorance might truly be a blessing. For 3 days, the tension in the quarters was palpable. Peter continued his work with the horses, but everyone noticed how the other workers found excuses to check on him throughout the day. Moses would walk past the stables on his way to the well, Ruth would linger near the stable yard when hanging laundry, and even Big Tom found reasons to inspect the fence posts that bordered the horse paddock. The black stallion seemed to sense the unusual attention as well. The magnificent animal, normally calm and responsive to Peter's commands, became increasingly skittish and unpredictable. Perhaps it was the extra visitors to the stable area, Or maybe animals possessed their own sensitivity to the currents of fear and expectation that were flowing through the plantation community. Even Crawford seemed unusually watchful, though he would never admit to believing in what he called slave superstitions. The overseer had his own reasons for paying attention to Samuel's predictions. Any disruption to the plantation's routine was his responsibility, and he had no desire to explain to Master Whitmore why valuable property had been damaged due to his negligence. On the third day, exactly as Samuel had foretold, disaster struck. The morning had started normally, with Peter leading the horses out to pasture and beginning his daily routine of grooming and exercise. The black stallion seemed calmer than he had been in recent days, and Peter allowed himself to hope that Samuel's prediction had been wrong. Peter was leading the black stallion to the water trough when something spooked the animal, perhaps a snake in the grass, or simply the weight of expectation that had been building for days. The horse reared up, its hooves flashing in the afternoon sun, and Peter lost his grip on the lead rope. The stallion came down hard, its shoulder slamming into Peter's chest and sending him flying backward. His head struck the wooden fence post with a sickening crack that echoed across the stable yard. The sound was so loud and final that everyone within hearing distance knew immediately that something terrible had happened. Peter lay motionless on the ground, blood pooling beneath his head where it had struck the post. The black stallion, now calm again, stood nearby as if confused by what had just occurred. Several workers rushed to Peter's aid, but it was clear that his injuries were severe. Peter never regained consciousness. He died 2 days later. His family gathered around his bedside in the small cabin he shared with his parents and 3 siblings. His mother, Sarah, held his hand and sang the lullabies she had sung to him as a child, while his father, Jacob, stood silently by the window, his shoulders shaking with grief he couldn't express aloud. The funeral was held on a Sunday evening, the only time when the enslaved community was allowed to gather for such purposes. They sang spirituals that spoke of freedom and reunion in the afterlife, their voices rising in harmony that seemed to transcend the boundaries of their earthly suffering. Peter was buried in the small cemetery behind the quarters, marked only by a wooden cross that Jacob had carved with his own hands. This time, Master Whitmore couldn't dismiss it as coincidence. 2 predictions, 2 deaths, both exactly as Samuel had described. The master called Samuel to the main house that evening, a summons that filled everyone with dread. Samuel walked the path to the big house with steady steps, his head held high despite the fear that gnawed at his stomach. The house loomed before him, its white columns and wraparound porch, a symbol of the wealth built on the backs of people like him. Gas lamps flickered in the windows, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock the darkness of the quarters where his people lived without such luxuries. Whitmore waited in his study, a room lined with books Samuel could never read and furnished with luxuries Samuel could never touch. The walls were covered with leather-bound volumes on agriculture, philosophy, and law, knowledge that was forbidden to enslaved people under penalty of death. A crystal decanter of whiskey sat on the mahogany desk, alongside papers detailing the plantation's financial records and correspondence with other plantation owners. The master sat behind his mahogany desk, his pale eyes studying Samuel with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Whitmore prided himself on being a rational man, but the accuracy of Samuel's predictions challenged everything he believed about the natural order of the world. "Boy," Whitmore began, his voice deceptively calm, "I hear you've been making predictions about death. Some folks might call that witchcraft." Samuel met his gaze without flinching. "I only speak what I see, Master. I don't choose the visions, they choose me." "And what exactly do you see?" "Death, sir. When it's coming, how it will happen. I see it clear as I see you now." Whitmore leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the desk. In the antebellum South, accusations of witchcraft or supernatural abilities among enslaved people were taken seriously, not because the masters believed in such things, but because they feared the power these beliefs held over their human property. "You will speak of this to no one," Whitmore commanded. "No more predictions, no more visions. If I hear you've been filling my slaves' heads with this nonsense, you'll find yourself on the auction block faster than you can blink. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Master," Samuel replied quietly. But as he walked back to the quarters that night, Samuel knew he couldn't stop the visions any more than he could stop the sun from rising. The gift or curse that had been placed upon him was beyond his control, and deep in his heart, he sensed that the worst was yet to come. Despite Master Whitmore's warning, Samuel's visions continued with terrifying accuracy. Over the next 8 months, he predicted 10 more deaths, each one unfolding exactly as he had foreseen. The plantation became a place where fear walked hand in hand with the living, where every word Samuel spoke was analyzed for hidden meaning, and where the line between the natural and supernatural seemed to blur with each passing day. The deaths came in waves, each one confirming what everyone had begun to suspect. Samuel possessed a power that defied explanation. There was Jenny, the young mother who died in childbirth just as Samuel had warned, her screams echoing through the quarters as she struggled to bring new life into a world that offered so little hope. Thomas, the field hand who was crushed by a falling tree during a storm Samuel had seen coming weeks before, his body broken beneath the massive oak that had stood for over a century. Old Ben, who choked on his evening meal exactly when Samuel said he would, his final moments witnessed by a dozen horrified onlookers who could do nothing to save him. Each death was preceded by Samuel's quiet announcement, delivered with the same calm certainty that had marked his first prediction about Martha. He would stop whatever he was doing, his eyes would take on that familiar distant look, and he would speak the words that everyone had come to dread. The details were always specific, always accurate, and always unavoidable. The enslaved community was divided in their response to Samuel's gift. Some viewed him as a prophet, a man chosen by God to prepare them for loss. They would seek him out quietly, hoping for reassurance about their own fate or that of their loved ones. These believers saw Samuel's visions as a form of divine mercy, a way to say goodbye, to make peace with the inevitable, to prepare their souls for what was coming. Mama Rose, the elderly spiritual leader of the quarters, was among those who believed Samuel had been touched by divine power. She would often sit with him in the evenings, reading passages from the worn Bible she had somehow learned to decipher despite the laws against teaching enslaved people to read. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she would tell him. "Maybe he's given you this burden so you can help folks prepare for their journey home." But others feared him as a harbinger of doom, believing that his very presence attracted death to their midst. They would cross themselves when he passed, whisper protective prayers, and warn their children to stay away from the man who spoke with death. "Maybe he's the one causing it," whispered Celia, a young woman who worked in the cotton fields. "Maybe he's got some kind of deal with the devil." Celia had arrived at the plantation only 2 years earlier, sold away from her family in Virginia when her previous master fell into debt. She had never fully integrated into the community, always remaining somewhat apart, suspicious of the bonds that others formed. Samuel's predictions terrified her in a way that went beyond rational fear. They represented a loss of control that reminded her too much of her own powerlessness. "Don't talk foolishness," scolded her grandmother, Mama Rose, the unofficial spiritual leader of the quarters. "That man's carrying a burden heavier than any of us can imagine. You think he wants to see death coming for folks he's known all his life?" Mama Rose had lived through more than most could imagine. Born in Africa and brought to America as a child, she had survived the Middle Passage, the breaking of families, and decades of brutality that would have destroyed a lesser spirit. Her faith had sustained her through unimaginable hardships, and she recognized in Samuel a fellow soul touched by forces beyond human understanding. But the fear was infectious. Workers began avoiding Samuel, crossing to the other side of the path when they saw him coming. Conversation stopped when he entered a room. Children were warned to stay away from the man who spoke with death. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Samuel's gift. At a time when he most needed human connection and support, he found himself increasingly alone. The physical manifestations of his visions were becoming more pronounced as well. Samuel would often be found collapsed in the fields after receiving a particularly vivid vision, his body convulsing, as if he were experiencing the death he had foreseen. These episodes left him weak and disoriented, adding to the community's fear that he was somehow possessed or cursed. The white overseers and the Whitmore family were equally unsettled, though they expressed it differently. Crawford increased his patrols around the quarters, convinced that Samuel's predictions were somehow connected to plans for rebellion. The overseer had heard stories from other plantations about enslaved people who claimed supernatural powers as a way of organizing resistance, and he was determined not to let such activities take root on his watch. Crawford's suspicions weren't entirely unfounded. Throughout the South, enslaved people often used spiritual beliefs and practices as a form of resistance, creating networks of communication and support that existed outside the master's control. Conjure doctors, root workers, and spiritual leaders wielded significant influence in enslaved communities, sometimes serving as focal points for organized resistance. Mrs. Whitmore, a nervous woman who had always been uncomfortable around the enslaved people, began having nightmares about dark magic and voodoo curses. She started wearing a small silver cross at all times and insisted that the house servants undergo regular inspections to ensure they weren't carrying any heathen charms or other objects that might be used for supernatural purposes. Eleanor Whitmore had grown up on her father's plantation in South Carolina, where stories of conjure and root work were common. She had always prided herself on being above such superstitions, but Samuel's accurate predictions challenged her rational worldview in ways that left her feeling vulnerable and afraid. Master Whitmore found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't sell Samuel without admitting that he believed in the man's supernatural abilities, which would make him a laughingstock among his peers. The Southern planter class prided itself on rational, scientific approaches to agriculture and slave management. Admitting that one of his enslaved workers possessed genuine supernatural abilities would undermine his reputation and possibly his business relationships. But keeping Samuel on the plantation meant living with the constant reminder that there were forces in the world beyond his control. Whitmore had built his entire identity around the belief that he was master of his domain, that his will and authority were absolute within the boundaries of his property. Samuel's visions represented a challenge to that authority that went beyond simple disobedience. They suggested that there were powers greater than any earthly master. The tension reached its breaking point on a cold February morning in 1848. Samuel had been working in the fields when he suddenly stopped, his hoe falling from his hands as his eyes took on that familiar distant look. The other workers immediately stopped what they were doing, recognizing the signs that preceded one of Samuel's predictions. "Master Whitmore's brother," he said, his voice carrying across the cotton rows. "He's coming to visit next week, but he won't make it past the front gate. His heart will give out before he can dismount his horse." This prediction was different from the others in a crucial way. It involved a member of the master's family crossing the invisible but absolute line that separated the enslaved community from their owners. Previous predictions had concerned only enslaved people, allowing the white family to maintain some psychological distance from Samuel's gift. But this prediction struck at the heart of the plantation's power structure. This time, Samuel's prediction reached the main house within hours. A field hand named Moses, hoping to curry favor with the overseers, reported what he had heard. Moses was a complex figure in the community, a man who had learned to survive by carefully balancing loyalty to his fellow enslaved people with the need to avoid punishment from the overseers. His decision to report Samuel's prediction would haunt him for the rest of his life. Crawford immediately brought the news to Master Whitmore, who flew into a rage unlike anything the plantation had ever seen. The master's reaction was so violent that even Crawford, accustomed to Whitmore's temper, was taken aback by the intensity of his fury. "Bring him to me," Whitmore roared, his face turning purple with rage. "Bring that devil to me now." Samuel was dragged from the fields and forced to his knees in the main house parlor. The room was filled with the symbols of Whitmore's wealth and status: imported furniture, oil paintings of his ancestors, and delicate china that represented more money than most enslaved people would see in a lifetime. The contrast between Samuel's rough work clothes and the room's luxury was stark and intentional. Whitmore stood over him, his face red with fury and fear. The master's hands were shaking. Whether from rage or terror, Samuel couldn't tell. "How dare you speak of my family?" he shouted. "How dare you put your curse on my blood?" "I don't curse anyone, master," Samuel replied calmly. "I only see what's coming. Your brother's heart is weak. The journey here will be too much for him." The vision had been particularly clear and detailed. Samuel had seen Whitmore's brother, a heavy-set man in his 60s, arriving at the plantation in a carriage, his face flushed from the exertion of travel. He had watched as the man attempted to dismount, only to clutch his chest and collapse, his heart finally giving out under the strain of years of rich food and sedentary living. Whitmore struck Samuel across the face, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. "You will take back those words. You will tell me you were lying." But Samuel couldn't take back what he had seen. The vision was as clear as daylight, as undeniable as the sunrise. He had learned that his gift didn't discriminate. Death came for rich and poor, black and white, master and slave with equal certainty. "I cannot unsee what has been shown to me," Samuel said quietly, blood trickling from his split lip. Whitmore ordered Samuel to be locked in the root cellar beneath the main house, a dark, cramped space usually reserved for storing vegetables. The cellar was barely large enough for a man to stand upright, with stone walls that wept moisture and air that smelled of earth and decay. For 3 days, Samuel remained in that underground prison, given only bread and water, while Whitmore waited to see if his brother would arrive safely. The isolation in the cellar gave Samuel time to reflect on the burden he carried. In the darkness, surrounded by the smell of stored potatoes and preserved vegetables, he wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Why had he been chosen to bear this gift? What was he supposed to do with the knowledge of death that came to him unbidden? Was he meant to warn people, or would his warnings only cause more suffering? On the 4th day, a rider came galloping up the plantation road, his horse lathered with sweat, and his face grave with news. Whitmore's brother had indeed died exactly as Samuel had predicted, at the front gate of a heart attack. Before he could even dismount his horse, the man had been found by his own driver, clutching his chest and gasping for breath that would never come. The news spread through the plantation like wildfire. Samuel's 12th prediction had come true, and this time it had touched the master's own family. The enslaved workers whispered that Samuel was either blessed by God or cursed by the devil, but no one could deny that he possessed a power beyond human understanding. When Whitmore finally released Samuel from the cellar, the master's face was ashen, his hands trembling with a mixture of grief and terror. The death of his brother had shaken him to his core, not just because of the loss, but because it confirmed that Samuel's power was real and that it could reach even into the protected world of the plantation's white family. "Stay away from my family," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Whatever devil's bargain you've made, keep it away from my blood." But Samuel knew that his visions didn't discriminate between black and white, slave and master. Death came for everyone, and he was merely its unwilling messenger. The burden of this knowledge weighed on him more heavily with each passing day, and he began to wonder if his own death might be the only release from the terrible gift that had been placed upon him. Spring arrived early in 1848, bringing with it a sense of unease that seemed to permeate every corner of the Whitmore plantation. Samuel's reputation had spread beyond the plantation boundaries, carried by traveling merchants and visiting overseers to neighboring farms. Some came seeking his predictions, others came to see the prophet's slave for themselves, but all left with the same unsettled feeling that they had encountered something beyond their understanding. Word of Samuel's abilities had reached as far as Savannah and Atlanta, where plantation owners gathered in gentlemen's clubs to discuss the strange case of the enslaved man who could predict death. Some dismissed the stories as superstitious nonsense, but others were intrigued enough to make the journey to Whitmore's plantation to witness Samuel's gift firsthand. These visits created an additional layer of tension, as Whitmore found himself in the uncomfortable position of either denying his slave's abilities or admitting that he believed in supernatural phenomena. Samuel himself had grown gaunt and hollow-eyed. The weight of seeing death before it arrived had taken its toll on his spirit. He ate little, slept less, and spent his days moving through his work like a man walking in a dream. The other enslaved workers gave him a wide berth, their fear and reverence creating an invisible barrier around him that left him more isolated than ever. The physical toll of his visions was becoming increasingly apparent. Samuel had lost significant weight, his clothes hanging loose on his frame like burial shrouds. His hair had begun to gray prematurely, and deep lines had etched themselves around his eyes, the marks of a man who had seen too much, who carried knowledge that no human being was meant to possess. Dr. Morrison, the plantation's physician, had examined Samuel at Whitmore's request, hoping to find some medical explanation for his condition. But the doctor could find nothing wrong beyond general exhaustion and what he termed melancholia, a condition he attributed to the strain of plantation life rather than any supernatural burden. It was on a humid April morning, as the cotton plants were just beginning to sprout their first green shoots, that Samuel experienced his most vivid and terrifying vision yet. He was working alone in the far field, a section of the plantation that bordered the dark waters of the Ogeechee River, when the world around him suddenly faded away, replaced by images so clear and immediate that he felt as if he were living them rather than seeing them. The vision came with an intensity that dwarfed all his previous experiences. Instead of the usual distant observation of death, Samuel found himself experiencing his own final moments with a clarity that was both terrifying and strangely peaceful. He could feel the rough hemp of the rope around his neck, could hear the murmur of the crowd gathered to witness his execution, could see the faces of people he had known and worked alongside for years. But this time the face looking back at him from the vision was his own. Samuel saw himself 3 days hence, standing at the edge of the plantation's old oak tree, the same tree where runaway slaves had been hanged in years past. The massive oak was over 200 years old, its gnarled branches having witnessed countless acts of brutality and injustice. Spanish moss draped from its limbs like funeral shrouds, and the ground beneath it was said to be cursed by the blood of those who had died there. He saw the rope around his neck, saw Master Whitmore's face twisted with rage and fear, saw the crowd of enslaved workers forced to watch as an example. But most clearly of all, he saw his own eyes in those final moments, not filled with fear but with a strange sense of peace, as if he were finally being released from a burden too heavy to bear. The vision was so powerful that Samuel collapsed in the field, his body convulsing as if he were experiencing his own death in that moment. The seizure lasted for nearly an hour, during which Samuel's consciousness seemed to exist in 2 places at once, in his physical body lying in the cotton field, and in the future moment of his execution. When he finally regained consciousness, the sun had moved significantly across the sky, and Moses was standing over him with a worried expression. Moses had been searching for Samuel when he found him collapsed among the cotton plants, his body rigid and his eyes rolled back in his head. "Samuel, you all right, brother? You've been lying here for near an hour. I thought you was dead for sure." Samuel sat up slowly, his mind still reeling from what he had seen. For the first time since his visions began, he was faced with a terrible choice. He had always shared his predictions, believing that people deserved to know what was coming. That knowledge, even terrible knowledge, was better than ignorance. But this vision was different. This was about his own death, and sharing it would likely ensure that it came to pass. The moral weight of this decision pressed down on Samuel like a physical burden. If he remained silent, perhaps the vision wouldn't come true. Perhaps his death could be avoided. But if he spoke, if he shared what he had seen, he would be setting in motion the very events that would lead to his execution. Yet how could he break the pattern of honesty that had defined his gift? How could he withhold the truth when truth had been the foundation of everything he had done? That evening, as the enslaved workers gathered for their meager supper, Samuel stood before them one final time. The familiar hush fell over the group as they recognized the look in his eyes, the same distant gaze that had preceded every one of his accurate predictions. But this time, there was something different in his expression, a sadness so profound that it seemed to emanate from his very soul. The communal area behind the quarters had become a sacred space of sorts, the place where Samuel had delivered all of his previous predictions. The workers had unconsciously arranged themselves in a circle, with Samuel at the center, as if they were participating in some ancient ritual. The flickering light of their small fire cast dancing shadows on their faces, creating an atmosphere that seemed to exist outside of normal time. "I have seen my own ending," he said simply, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. 3 days from now, at sunset, I will hang from the old oak. Master Whitmore will order it, believing that my death will end the fear that has gripped this place. The reaction was immediate and intense. Some workers began to weep, others to pray. The sound of their grief rose into the night air like a lament, a collective mourning for a death that had not yet occurred, but was already accepted as inevitable. A few of the younger men, led by Moses, began talking in urgent whispers about preventing Samuel's fate. Moses had grown close to Samuel over the months, serving as his unofficial protector, and the bridge between Samuel and the rest of the community. The thought of losing Samuel filled him with a desperate determination to change what seemed unchangeable. "We can hide you," Moses said, his voice filled with desperate determination. "There are places in the swamp where they'll never find you. You can escape, head north like others have done. There's talk of something called the Underground Railroad, people who help folks like us get to freedom." Moses had heard whispers of the network of abolitionists and sympathizers who helped enslaved people escape to the north. The very existence of such a network was a closely guarded secret, spoken of only in the most trusted circles. But Moses was willing to risk everything to save the man who had become both prophet and friend to their community. But Samuel shook his head sadly, his expression filled with a resignation that went beyond mere acceptance of fate. "You don't understand, brother. I don't choose these visions. They choose me. And I've never seen one that didn't come to pass. Running would only delay the inevitable and bring punishment down on all of you." Samuel's refusal to flee wasn't born of fatalism, but of a deep understanding of the nature of his gift. Every vision had come true exactly as he had seen it, without exception. To fight against this final vision would be to deny the very power that had defined the last year of his life. More importantly, he knew that any attempt to help him escape would result in terrible punishment for those who tried to help. "Then why tell us?" asked Ruth, tears streaming down her face. "Why burden us with this knowledge?" Ruth's question struck at the heart of the moral dilemma that had tormented Samuel since his first vision. What was the purpose of prophecy if it couldn't prevent suffering? What good came from knowledge that only caused pain? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the flickering light of the small fire around which they had gathered. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who had wrestled with impossible questions and found his own truth. "Because for once, I wanted to say goodbye. Because I wanted you to know that seeing death coming doesn't make it any less frightening, but it does give you time to make peace with it. And because I want you to remember that my death, like all the others I've seen, is not an ending but a transformation." Over the next 2 days, the plantation existed in a state of suspended tension. The enslaved workers went about their duties mechanically, their eyes constantly seeking out Samuel, as if watching him could somehow prevent the fate he had foreseen. There was a surreal quality to these final days, as if the entire community was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable to unfold. Samuel spent these last days saying goodbye in his own quiet way. He shared his few possessions among the other workers, gave final words of advice to the younger men, and spent long hours in conversation with Mama Rose about the nature of faith and destiny. He seemed to grow more peaceful with each passing hour, as if the approach of his predicted death was bringing him a kind of relief. Master Whitmore seemed oblivious to the undercurrent of dread that had settled over his property, focused as he was on the spring planting and the arrival of new equipment from Savannah. But the tension was building toward an inevitable confrontation, and everyone except Whitmore himself seemed to sense that something momentous was about to occur. But on the 3rd day, everything changed. It began with a small incident, a broken plow that delayed the morning's work. The plow had been damaged when it struck a hidden rock in the field, bending the blade and making it unusable until repairs could be made. Such incidents were common enough, but this one occurred at a time when tensions were already running high. Crawford, already irritable from the humid weather and the strange atmosphere that had pervaded the plantation for days, took out his frustration on the nearest worker, who happened to be Samuel. The overseer's accusations grew more heated, his voice rising as he blamed Samuel for everything from the broken equipment to the general atmosphere of unease that had plagued the plantation for months. "It's you!" Crawford shouted, his face red with anger and something that might have been fear. "Ever since you started spouting your devil's prophecies, nothing's gone right around here. You're a curse on this place, a walking curse." Crawford's words revealed the depth of his own fear and superstition. Despite his claims to rational thinking, the overseer had been deeply affected by Samuel's accurate predictions. The idea that an enslaved person might possess power beyond his understanding challenged everything Crawford believed about the natural order of the world. The confrontation drew the attention of other workers and eventually Master Whitmore himself, who emerged from the main house to see what was causing the commotion. When Crawford explained his theory that Samuel was somehow responsible for all the plantation's recent troubles, Whitmore's face grew dark, with a mixture of fear and rage that had been building for months. "Do you think you can curse my family and my property?" Whitmore demanded, advancing on Samuel with clenched fists. "You think your devil's magic gives you power over me?" Samuel stood calmly in the face of his master's fury, his eyes holding that same peaceful expression he had seen in his vision. There was no defiance in his posture, no challenge to Whitmore's authority, only a quiet acceptance of what was to come. "I have no power over anyone, Master. I only see what's coming." "Then see this!" Whitmore roared, and he ordered Crawford to prepare a rope. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Samuel was led to the old oak tree at the edge of the plantation grounds. The entire enslaved population was forced to watch, just as he had foreseen. Some wept openly, others stood in stunned silence, but all understood that they were witnessing the end of something that had changed their lives forever. The old oak stood like a monument to suffering, its massive trunk scarred by the ropes that had been thrown over its branches in years past. Spanish moss hung from its limbs like funeral shrouds, swaying gently in the evening breeze. The ground beneath the tree was bare, worn smooth by the feet of those who had been forced to witness previous executions. As the rope was placed around his neck, Samuel looked out over the faces of the people he had known and worked alongside for so many years. His final words were spoken quietly, but they carried clearly in the still evening air. "Don't fear the visions that may come to others after me. Death is not the enemy. It's the fear of death that enslaves us all. Find your freedom in knowing that every ending is also a beginning." As the sun touched the horizon, Samuel's prediction came to pass with the same terrible accuracy that had marked all the others. But in his final moments, those who watched saw something unexpected in his eyes, not fear or despair, but a profound sense of release, as if he were finally free from the burden that had defined his final year of life. The rope tightened, and Samuel's earthly journey came to an end. But his words, his courage, and his example would live on in the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed his final act of prophecy, the prediction of his own death, delivered with the same calm certainty that had marked all his visions, and accepted with a grace that transformed his execution from an act of punishment into something approaching martyrdom. In the days following Samuel's death, a strange thing happened on the Whitmore plantation. The atmosphere of fear that had gripped the place for nearly a year began to lift, replaced by something else entirely, a quiet sense of defiance that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Samuel's final words about freedom and new beginnings had taken root in the hearts of his fellow workers, transforming his death from a tragedy into a catalyst for change. The enslaved workers spoke of Samuel not as a harbinger of doom, but as a man who had faced his own death with courage and dignity. His final words about freedom became a whispered mantra in the quarters, passed from person to person like a secret prayer. The very fact that Samuel had predicted his own death and faced it without fear became a source of inspiration for people who had lived their entire lives in terror of their master's whims. Mama Rose, the spiritual leader of the community, began incorporating Samuel's story into her evening prayers and teachings. She spoke of him as a modern-day prophet, a man who had been given the terrible gift of foresight so that he could teach others about courage and faith. Her interpretation of Samuel's life and death helped the community process their grief while finding meaning in his sacrifice. "Samuel showed us that even when we can't change what's coming, we can choose how we face it," she would tell the gathered workers. "He showed us that there's a kind of freedom that no master can take away, the freedom to meet our fate with dignity." Master Whitmore, expecting his property to return to its former state of fearful obedience, instead found himself dealing with a workforce that seemed somehow changed. They still performed their duties, but there was a new quality to their silence, not the silence of fear, but the silence of people who had seen something that transcended their daily suffering. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. Workers who had previously cowered when overseers approached now met their eyes with quiet dignity. Tasks that had once been performed with the desperate efficiency of the terrified were now carried out with a calm competence that suggested inner strength rather than external compulsion. Whitmore noticed these changes, but couldn't quite articulate what was different. His enslaved workers were still obedient, still productive, but there was something in their demeanor that made him uncomfortable. It was as if Samuel's death had removed a layer of fear that Whitmore hadn't realized he depended upon to maintain control. Within 6 months, 3 enslaved workers had successfully escaped from the plantation, using routes through the swamp that had never been discovered before. The escapes were carefully planned and flawlessly executed, suggesting a level of organization and communication that would have been impossible under the previous atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Moses led the first escape, taking with him 2 younger men who had been inspired by Samuel's example of courage in the face of death. They disappeared into the night like ghosts, leaving no trace of their passage except for a small wooden cross left on Samuel's grave, a sign that his memory lived on in their hearts. Others began to organize in small groups, sharing information and resources in ways that would have been unthinkable before Samuel's death. The community that had once been divided by fear and suspicion was now united by a shared understanding of what it meant to face adversity with dignity and courage. Moses, who had tried so desperately to save Samuel, became an unofficial leader among the workers. He often spoke of how Samuel's willingness to face his own death had shown them all that there were things more powerful than fear, things like dignity, courage, and the unbreakable human spirit. Samuel taught us that we don't have to be afraid of dying, Moses would say. And if we're not afraid of dying, then we don't have to be afraid of living either. The story of Samuel's predictions spread throughout the South, carried by escaped slaves and sympathetic abolitionists. Some versions painted him as a mystical figure with supernatural powers, others as a man whose deep understanding of human nature allowed him to see patterns others missed. But all versions agreed on one thing: Samuel had faced death without fear, and in doing so, had shown others how to face life without fear. Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist and former slave, heard Samuel's story during a speaking tour through Georgia and incorporated elements of it into his speeches about the dignity and courage of enslaved people. Douglass saw in Samuel's story a powerful example of how the human spirit could transcend even the most oppressive circumstances. This man, Samuel, Douglass would tell his audiences, possessed a gift that his masters feared more than any weapon, the gift of seeing truth clearly and speaking it without fear. His courage in the face of death reminds us that freedom is not something that can be given or taken away by others, but something that exists within the human soul. Master Whitmore never spoke publicly about Samuel's predictions or their accuracy, but those who knew him noticed that he seemed to age rapidly after Samuel's death, his hair turning white and his hands developing a tremor that never quite went away. The rational, controlling man who had once prided himself on his mastery over his domain seemed diminished, haunted by the memory of a slave who had possessed knowledge beyond his understanding. Whitmore began drinking more heavily, often sitting alone in his study late into the night, staring out the window toward the old oak tree where Samuel had died. Visitors to the plantation noticed that he seemed nervous and distracted, jumping at unexpected sounds and showing an unusual interest in the spiritual beliefs of his enslaved workers. He sold the plantation in 1851 and moved north, claiming that the Georgia climate no longer agreed with him. But those close to the family knew that Whitmore could no longer bear to live in a place where he had been forced to confront the limits of his own power and understanding. The old oak tree where Samuel died became a place of pilgrimage for enslaved people from neighboring plantations. They would come in secret, leaving small offerings and whispering prayers for courage and freedom. Even after the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, people continued to visit the tree, now seeing it as a symbol of the strength that could be found in facing one's fears. The tree itself seemed to take on a sacred quality in the years following Samuel's death. Local folklore claimed that it never lost its leaves, even in the harshest winters, and that those who prayed beneath its branches would find the courage to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Historians who have studied the Whitmore Plantation records note that Samuel's story represents something unique in the annals of slavery, a man who used what others saw as a curse to inspire hope and resistance. Whether his visions were supernatural gifts, psychological insights, or simply the observations of a man who understood the fragility of life, their impact was undeniably real. Dr. James Patterson, a historian at the University of Georgia, wrote in his 1923 study of antebellum plantation life, "The case of Samuel represents a fascinating intersection of folk belief, psychological phenomena, and social resistance. Regardless of the source of his apparent prophetic abilities, his influence on his community was profound and lasting." Samuel's legacy lived on in the stories told by those who had known him, stories that emphasized not his ability to predict death, but his courage in the face of it. His final words about freedom became part of the oral tradition that sustained enslaved communities throughout the South. A reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit could find ways to transcend its limitations. The Underground Railroad conductors, who helped enslaved people escape to freedom, often invoked Samuel's memory, telling fugitives that if a man could face his own death with such courage, they could certainly find the strength to risk everything for freedom. His story became a source of inspiration for countless individuals who chose to flee slavery rather than accept their bondage. In the end, Samuel's greatest prophecy may have been his last, that every ending is also a beginning. His death marked the end of his own suffering, but it also marked the beginning of something new for those he left behind. An understanding that true freedom comes not from the absence of fear, but from the courage to face it. The man who had seen death coming for so many others had, in his final act, shown them all how to truly live. His visions of death had become, paradoxically, a vision of life, a life lived with dignity, courage, and an unshakable faith in the power of the human spirit to transcend even the most impossible circumstances. Years later, when former slaves gathered to share their memories of bondage and freedom, Samuel's story would be told and retold, each telling adding new layers of meaning and inspiration. Children who had never known slavery would learn about the prophet who saw death but taught life, the man who faced his own execution with such grace that he transformed it into a victory. The Whitmore Plantation itself eventually fell into ruin, its fields returning to wilderness and its buildings crumbling under the weight of time and neglect. But the old oak tree remained, standing as a monument to one man's courage and the enduring power of truth spoken without fear. Local residents, both black and white, came to regard the tree as a sacred site. During the civil rights movement of the 1960s, activists would gather beneath its branches to pray and find strength for their own struggles against injustice. The tree that had once been a symbol of oppression and death had become a symbol of hope and transformation. In 1968, exactly 120 years after Samuel's death, a small plaque was placed at the base of the oak tree. It read simply, "In memory of Samuel who saw clearly and spoke truth without fear. His courage lives on in all who choose dignity over despair." The ceremony dedicating the plaque was attended by descendants of both the enslaved workers and the Whitmore family. Among those present was Moses Washington, the great-grandson of the Moses who had tried to save Samuel and later led the first escape from the plantation. In his remarks, Washington spoke of how Samuel's legacy had shaped his family's understanding of courage and resistance. "My great-grandfather used to tell us that Samuel didn't just predict the future, he helped create it," Washington said. "By showing us that we could face death without fear, he showed us that we could face anything without fear. That lesson has been passed down through 4 generations of my family, and it will continue to be passed down as long as we remember his name." The story of Samuel the prophet, as he came to be known in local folklore, eventually found its way into academic studies of slave resistance and folk belief. Scholars debated the nature of his apparent prophetic abilities, but all agreed on the profound impact his life and death had on his community and beyond. Dr. Angela Morrison, a professor of African American Studies at Emory University, wrote in her 1995 book, Voices from the Quarters. Samuel's story illustrates the complex ways in which enslaved people created meaning and resistance within the confines of bondage. Whether his visions were literal prophecy or metaphorical truth, they served as a powerful catalyst for community transformation and individual empowerment. The debate over the supernatural aspects of Samuel's story continues to this day, but perhaps that misses the point entirely. As Mama Rose might have said, the truth of Samuel's gift lay not in its source, but in its effect, the way it transformed a community of frightened, isolated individuals into a group of people who understood their own worth and dignity. Samuel's final prophecy, that every ending is also a beginning, proved to be the most accurate of all. His death was indeed an ending, but it was also the beginning of a new understanding of what it meant to be truly free. In facing his own mortality with such grace and courage, he had given his community something that no master could ever take away: the knowledge that the human spirit, once awakened to its own dignity, is truly indestructible. The man who had been cursed with the ability to see death had ultimately become a teacher of life, showing others that the greatest freedom comes not from avoiding our fate, but from meeting it with courage, dignity, and an unshakable faith in the power of truth. His legacy reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, there are always those who choose to light a candle rather than curse the darkness. And so Samuel's story lives on, not as a tale of supernatural phenomena or tragic fate, but as a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to find meaning, purpose, and even joy in the face of seemingly insurmountable adversity. His life and death continue to inspire those who hear his story, reminding them that true prophecy lies not in predicting the future, but in having the courage to face it with dignity and grace. This incredible story reminds us that even in humanity's darkest chapters, there are individuals whose courage and dignity shine through the darkness. Samuel's legacy teaches us that true strength isn't found in avoiding our fears, but in facing them with grace and purpose. If this story moved you as much as it moved us, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more incredible historical narratives that reveal the extraordinary courage of ordinary people. Share this story with someone who needs to hear about the power of facing life's challenges with dignity and hope. What do you think about Samuel's story? Do you believe his visions were supernatural, or was he simply a man with extraordinary insight into human nature? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one and love hearing your thoughts on these powerful historical accounts. Until next time, remember, every ending is also a beginning. Also,